They thought she was just a nurse. Quiet, competent, forgettable in the way that good staff often are, the kind of woman who refilled the coffee machine before anyone noticed it was empty and could start an intravenous line on a screaming toddler without raising her voice. They were dead wrong, and by the time the truth walked through the doors of St. Anselm Trauma Center that night, it would leave half a room speechless and one man's career in ashes on the tile. Catherine Doran had worked the overnight shift at St. Anselm for 4 years, and in that time she had earned a reputation for 2 things: flawless triage instincts and an almost unnerving stillness under pressure. Colleagues joked that a bomb could go off in the parking lot, and Kate would simply ask for a second set of vitals. They meant it as a compliment, though none of them understood how literally true it was. She moved through chaos the way water moves through a canyon, shaping itself to whatever the moment demanded, without ever losing its own current. There was a scar that ran along her left collarbone, pale and old, shaped like a comma someone had carved with a dull blade. When asked, she said it was from a car accident in her 20s, delivered in a tone so flat and final that nobody ever asked twice. It was the kind of lie that had been polished smooth from repetition, a stone worn round by a river of years, and it fit so naturally into the story of her life that even she sometimes forgot the truth lived somewhere underneath it. The small things gave her away, if anyone had cared to look. The way she read a gunshot wound in half a second, naming entry and exit before the surgeon had even finished cutting away the shirt. The way her eyes flicked to doorways and roof lines out of habit, cataloguing angles the way other people noticed weather. The way she once corrected a second-year resident who insisted a wound path was a through and through, telling him with total calm that the trajectory indicated a downward shot from an elevated position, and being right, down to the degree. Nobody asked how a triage nurse knew ballistic geometry. They simply chalked it up to her strangeness and moved on. Dr. Preston Wexler, the newly appointed medical director of emergency services, had not worked at St. Anselm long enough to notice any of it, and would not have cared if he had. Wexler was the kind of physician who measured his worth in headlines and hospital board approval, a man whose white coat always looked freshly pressed even at 3 a.m, as though crisis itself were beneath wrinkling him. He had transferred in 6 months earlier from a private concierge practice, trailing rumors of donor money and a hunger for visibility that outpaced his hunger for medicine. To him, nurses were furniture that occasionally spoke. It was a Tuesday night, thick with a humid electric stillness, the kind of air that seemed to be holding its breath before a storm, when the radio at the nurses' station crackled with an incoming trauma unlike any St. Anselm had logged in years. Multiple gunshot wounds, male, approximately 30, vitals unstable. The dispatcher's voice carried an odd hesitation, as if reading from a script someone else had written for her, and at the very end, almost as an afterthought, she added that the patient would be arriving under military escort, and that identifying information was, for now, restricted. Kate felt something tighten low in her stomach the moment she heard the word restricted, a small, cold turn of the gears that she recognized instantly and hated herself for recognizing. She said nothing. She simply began setting up Trauma Bay 1 with the practiced silence of a woman who had done this 100 times, in places far uglier than a suburban emergency room, snapping open chest tube kits and rechecking the crash cart with hands that did not shake. The ambulance doors opened onto a scene that made even the hardened paramedics go quiet. The man on the gurney was pale as bone, his uniform cut away to reveal a chest packed with gauze already soaked through, his lips a bruised shade of blue. A tactical vest lay discarded beside his legs, stripped of insignia, though the calluses on his trigger finger and the burn scarring along his forearm told their own story to anyone who knew how to read it. Two soldiers in plain civilian jackets flanked the stretcher, faces carved from granite, and neither of them said a single unnecessary word as they handed him off. Wexler arrived at a brisk, self-important pace, clipboard in hand, already composing the press-friendly version of events in his head. He took one look at the patient, one look at the unmarked military escort disappearing back out into the parking lot, and decided this was precisely the kind of case that could make his name. He assigned himself lead physician on the spot, waved off two more experienced attendings, and when Kate stepped forward to take her usual position running trauma, he lifted a hand without even glancing at her. "I need real support in there tonight, Catherine. Not triage staff," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough for the hallway to hear. "Dr. Alvarez will run this with me. Why don't you handle the desk? This one's above your pay grade." She did not argue. She had learned, long before she ever wore scrubs, that arguing with a man drunk on his own authority wasted breath better spent elsewhere. She simply nodded, stepped back, and watched through the narrow window in the trauma bay door as strangers began fighting for a life she somehow already understood better than any of them. It was only minutes later that the second arrival came, quieter than the first, but somehow heavier in the air. A man in his 50s walked through the emergency room's sliding doors dressed in a plain grey jacket and jeans. Nothing about him remarkable except the way he moved, economical, upright, a posture that had been drilled into muscle memory decades earlier and never fully left. He asked the security guard in a low and level voice to see the patient who had just come in. He gave no name. He offered no explanation. The guard, following Wexler's standing orders that the case remain sealed from outside contact until identification cleared, told him he would have to wait outside like everyone else. The man in the grey jacket studied the guard for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then simply nodded. He turned, walked to the hallway bench outside the trauma bay, and sat down. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand a supervisor. He folded his hands in his lap and waited, still as a stone in a riverbed, while machines began screaming on the other side of the wall. Inside Trauma Bay 1, the machines had good reason to scream. The patient's oxygen saturation was cratering, his blood pressure sliding down like sand through a broken hourglass, and Dr. Alvarez's voice had climbed an octave as he called for more units of blood than the bay had readily on hand. Wexler, sweat beading along his hairline despite the air conditioning, barked orders that sounded confident and meant almost nothing, the panic underneath them thinly disguised as authority. The wounded man's name, unknown to the staff working on him, was Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Cole, and he had spent the last 11 hours doing what his body was no longer built to do. He had crawled 400 meters through brush with 2 rounds in his chest cavity, refusing to die until his team was clear, because that was what a sniper did when the mission mattered more than the man. Now, drowning slowly in his own blood beneath fluorescent lights that felt obscenely bright after years of operating in darkness, some small animal part of him refused to let go, even as his vision folded in at the edges like paper curling toward flame. Through the haze of hypoxia, one detail kept surfacing in his mind, insistent as a heartbeat. A voice. Not the voice in the room now, panicked and unfamiliar, but a memory of another voice, low, unhurried, utterly without fear, speaking to him through a radio headset years earlier in a valley that had tried very hard to kill him. That voice had once talked him through a shot he did not believe he could make, had walked him through wind calls and mirage and the precise, terrible mathematics of ending a life from 800 meters away, and had done it all with the calm of someone discussing the weather. He had never seen her face. He had only ever known her by a single word. Now, strapped to a table with a breathing bag forced over his mouth, Unable to speak past the plastic and the blood pooling in his throat, Cole heard something through the chaos that made every nerve in his failing body seize with sudden, impossible recognition. A woman's voice outside the room, low and clipped, correcting a nurse's compression rhythm through the door with a precision that had nothing to do with hospital training and everything to do with a discipline forged somewhere much colder and much darker. He knew that cadence. He had heard it call artillery grids and heard it whisper wind speeds into his ear while men tried to kill them both. With the last true strength left in his right hand, the hand that had once held a rifle steady through 100-mile-an-hour crosswind, Ethan Cole reached toward the surgical tray beside him. His fingers, slick with his own blood, closed around a marker meant for labeling specimen bags. He could not speak. He could not lift his head more than an inch off the table. But he could still write, and in letters jagged and desperate, he scrawled a single word across the pale rubber of a surgical glove lying within reach. He pressed the glove flat against his palm, and with the last coordinated effort his body would allow, lifted his arm toward the small reinforced window set into the trauma bay door, holding it there like a dying man raising a flag over the only ground he had left to defend. Kate had been standing at the nurse's station less than 10 feet away, jaw tight, watching the chaos unfold through the glass with the particular helplessness of a professional, forced to be a spectator in her own emergency room. It was pure instinct, the same instinct that had kept her alive through things this hospital would never know about, that made her glance up at exactly the right second. She saw the glove first, pale and trembling against the glass. Then she saw the word. Widow. The world did not exactly stop, but something inside her did, a gear seizing mid-turn, a held breath that had waited 4 years to be released. That word had not existed anywhere outside a sealed personnel file, and the memories of perhaps a dozen men, most of whom she had assumed were either dead or scattered to postings she would never learn of. It was the call sign she had carried through 3 tours as a force reconnaissance scout sniper, whispered over secure channels in places that did not appear on any map handed to civilians. Nobody in this hospital, in this city, in this entire chapter of her rebuilt life, was supposed to know that word existed. And yet, there it was, written in shaking, bloody letters, held up by a dying man like a prayer aimed directly at her chest. Kate went pale in a way the other nurses would later describe as unnatural, the color draining from her face so completely that for a moment she looked like something carved rather than flesh. Her hands, which had not trembled through a single code in 4 years, trembled now. She did not call for Wexler. She did not ask permission. She crossed the hallway in 3 strides, shouldered past a startled orderly, and shoved through the trauma bay door herself, moving with a purpose that made everyone inside the room instinctively step back as though sensing a shift in gravity they could not name. "I've got him," she said, and her voice had changed. It was no longer the polite, measured tone of a charge nurse offering support. It was flat, absolute, the voice of someone who had commanded far more dangerous rooms than this one. "Move!" Wexler opened his mouth to object, some reflexive assertion of territory rising automatically to his lips. But something in the way she looked at him made the words die there. Alvarez simply stepped aside without being asked twice, some old animal part of his brain recognizing authority when it walked into a room, regardless of the uniform it wore. What followed was not nursing. It was war medicine, the kind taught in places where the nearest hospital was a helicopter ride through hostile airspace, and the only surgeon available was your own bloodied hands. Kate's fingers found the wound tract in seconds, tracing the angle of entry with the certainty of someone who had studied trajectories her entire adult life. She called for a chest seal in terminology so specific, so clinically brutal, that Alvarez actually blinked. She packed the wound with a speed and economy of motion that made the attending physician standing behind her mutter something under his breath that sounded very much like a prayer. Cole's eyes, glassy with blood loss, found hers for just a moment as she leaned over him, and something passed between them that needed no words at all. Recognition. Relief. The particular wordless gratitude of a soldier realizing, in what he believed were his final minutes, that the person now holding his life in her hands was not a stranger playing a role, but someone who understood exactly what he had survived to reach this table. "Stay with me, Gunnery Sergeant," she said quietly, close to his ear, using the rank as though she had simply always known it. "You crawled 400 meters. You are not dying on my table over the last 4 feet. His mouth twitched, barely, around the plastic tube, forcing air into his lungs, something that might have been the ghost of a laugh in a man too broken to manage the sound. It was the only humor the room would see that night, dark and small, and entirely earned. For the next 11 minutes, St. Anselm's Trauma Bay 1 belonged to Catherine Doran in every way that mattered. She called compressions when his heart stuttered. She guided the needle decompression for the tension pneumothorax building, silently in his left chest, catching it a full 90 seconds before Alvarez even registered the falling oxygen saturation as anything but noise on a monitor. She stabilized him, inch by brutal inch, dragging him back from a ledge his body had already begun stepping off of, until at last the numbers on the monitor steadied into something that resembled survival rather than countdown. Outside in the hallway, Wexler stood rigid, humiliation curdling into something colder and more dangerous. He had been overruled in his own trauma bay by a woman he had dismissed as glorified triage staff not 30 minutes earlier, and every second she succeeded where his own leadership had faltered was a second etched permanently into the memory of every nurse and resident who had witnessed it. Men like Wexler did not forgive that kind of exposure. They found ways to punish it. He found his opportunity almost immediately. The moment Cole was stable enough to be wheeled toward imaging, Wexler stepped directly into Kate's path, his voice pitched low and venomous, meant for her ears alone, but sharp enough that the nearest nurses caught every word regardless. He informed her that she had grossly overstepped her authority, that she had endangered the chain of command in a classified case, and that he would be filing formal paperwork for insubordination, effective immediately, pending suspension review by the board. Kate looked at him with an expression that held no fear at all, only a distant, weary sort of patience, the look of someone who had faced down men far more dangerous than a hospital administrator with wounded pride. "File whatever you need to file," she said quietly. "He's alive. That's the only outcome that was ever going to satisfy me." She turned then and walked back toward the hallway bench, where the man in the gray jacket still sat exactly where he had been left, hands folded, spine straight, patient as stone despite the chaos that had unfolded 20 feet away for the better part of half an hour. He watched her approach with a stillness that mirrored her own, and something in his eyes sharpened as she drew close enough for him to study her face properly. "You're the one who went in," he said. It was not a question. "He wrote a word," Kate said simply. "I recognized it." The man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I know," he said. "I trained him to write it if he ever needed to find you. I did not think I would live to see him actually use it." Before Kate could ask the question forming behind her eyes, the emergency room's sliding doors opened again, and this time they did not open quietly. 3 men in dark tactical jackets stamped with federal-looking insignia strode in with the brisk, manufactured urgency of people who wanted to be seen as important before anyone had time to question why. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with cold, pale eyes and a jaw like a closed fist, approached the nurses' station and slid a folder across the counter toward the nearest staff member, announcing in a clipped, authoritative voice that they were there to take custody of the classified patient for immediate federal transport. Wexler, sensing an opportunity to salvage his evening and impress men who looked important enough to matter to a hospital board, hurried over almost eagerly, already reaching for the folder before anyone could stop him. He scanned the paperwork, nodded along with practiced deference, and turned to the nearest orderly to order Cole prepped for immediate transfer, his voice ringing with the false confidence of a man desperate to be seen doing something right for once that night. Kate watched the scene from 10 feet away, and every instinct she had spent years trying to bury screamed at once. She studied the lead man's posture, the way his jacket sat slightly too loose over a concealed holster positioned for a fast draw rather than standard carry, the way his eyes swept the room in tactical sectors rather than the casual scan of an actual federal agent walking into an unfamiliar building. She recognized the tell in his boots, tactical soles built for silent movement, not the standard-issue footwear any real agency would have issued. These were not government men. These were contractors, and contractors sent quietly into a hospital only ever came for one reason. Someone had sent them to finish what a bullet in a foreign valley had failed to accomplish, and they had chosen a hospital lobby to do it because hospitals were soft, predictable, full of people trained to comply rather than resist. Kate's mind moved through the calculation in less than a second, cold and clean, the same calculation she had made 100 times before in places where hesitation cost lives. 3 visible operators, at least one more likely covering the exterior. Cole strapped to a gurney, unarmed, unable to defend himself, seconds from being wheeled directly into the hands of the men who had put him on that table in the first place. "Do not sign that transfer," she said, and her voice cut across the nurses' station with a flat, absolute authority that made 2 residents actually flinch. Wexler, folder half raised, turned toward her with irritation already curling his mouth, ready to remind her once again of her place in this hospital's hierarchy. "This does not concern you, Catherine," he snapped. "This is federal jurisdiction. Unless you'd like to add obstruction to your growing list of problems tonight, I suggest you step back and let people with actual authority handle this." The lead contractor smiled thinly at that, the expression of a man enjoying watching someone else do his intimidation for him, and gestured for 2 orderlies to begin unlocking the gurney's wheels. It was, Kate would later understand, the single mistake that ended his evening. Because the moment his hand moved toward the gurney rail, she was already moving too, and the grey-jacketed man on the bench was rising off the bench beside her, without a word passing between them, the 2 of them falling into a rhythm so old and so practiced that it required no communication at all. "Sir," Kate said to the contractor, her tone suddenly gentle, almost conversational, the tone of someone about to ask directions. "Who authorized this transfer order?" "That's classified," the man said, not bothering to look at her, already gripping the gurney rail. "Then so is this," she said, and closed the distance between them in a single, fluid step. What happened next took 4 seconds, and every person in that emergency room would spend the rest of their careers describing it differently, because none of their eyes had been trained to actually follow it. Kate's hand closed over the contractor's wrist as it reached for the gurney, twisting it at an angle that turned his own momentum against the joint, and in the same motion she drove her elbow up and back into the side of his skull with a precision that dropped him boneless to the tile before he even registered pain. The second contractor lunged toward her, reaching for the pistol beneath his jacket, and the grey-jacketed man was already there, catching his forearm and driving him face first into the reinforced glass of the nurses' station, hard enough to spiderweb the pane, the weapon clattering harmlessly across the floor. The third man, older and more cautious than his companions, took one look at what had just happened to the other two and made the correct tactical decision to reach for his radio instead of his weapon, calling for immediate backup in a voice that cracked with something close to panic. Kate was on him before he finished the sentence, sweeping his legs out from under him and pinning his radio hand to the floor with a knee positioned to fold the wrist backward if he so much as twitched. The entire emergency room had gone utterly silent, except for the low, steady beeping of monitors and the faint hiss of the shattered glass settling in its frame. Wexler stood frozen at the nurse's station, the folder still clutched in his hand, his mouth open on words that refused to form themselves into sound. He stared at Kate, kneeling calm and unhurried atop a man twice her size, her breathing barely elevated, her expression as composed as it had been when she'd asked a resident to recheck a blood pressure cuff an hour earlier. Every nurse, every orderly, every terrified family member in the waiting room had turned to watch, and the silence that followed had the particular texture of a held breath, the moment right before understanding arrives and reshapes everything that came before it. It was the grey-jacketed man who spoke first, straightening his collar with unhurried calm, as though he had done nothing more strenuous than sit down for coffee. "Someone call hospital security to hold these three," he said, "and someone else needs to lock down every exit. There's likely a fourth outside covering the lot." As if summoned by the words themselves, the low mechanical thunder of rotor blades began to swell somewhere above the building, growing from a distant murmur into a pressing physical presence that rattled the windows along the ambulance bay. Red and white lights swept across the parking lot glass moments later, and every head in the emergency room turned as a military transport helicopter descended onto the hospital's helipad with the unmistakable authority of something that did not ask permission to land where it chose. The doors of the emergency room burst open under the force of the rotor wash still dying outside, and a man walked through them who did not need an introduction to command the room, though he received one anyway. He wore the uniform of a lieutenant general, 3 stars gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his presence radiating the particular gravity of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him without being asked. 2 armed escorts flanked him, but they hung back respectfully as he strode directly past Wexler without so much as a glance, his eyes fixed entirely on the woman still kneeling on the floor beside a groaning, restrained contractor. "Gunnery Sergeant Doran," he said, and the words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward through every stunned face present. "It's been a long time." Kate rose slowly to her feet, releasing the man beneath her to hospital security officers who had finally found the nerve to approach, and faced the general with an expression that had shed every trace of the quiet, deferential nurse St. Anselm had known for 4 years. What stood in her place now carried itself differently, spine straight, chin level, the posture of someone who had once answered to nothing, softer than a chain of command, forged in blood and consequence. "General Reyes," she said quietly, "I didn't expect to see you again. Neither did I expect to find you working nights in a hospital under a name that wasn't yours," Reyes said, his booming voice carrying easily across the stunned silence of the emergency room, deliberately pitched for every listening ear present, including the one belonging to a certain hospital administrator, now standing very still near the nurses' station, with the color draining slowly from his face. 4 years ago, this woman was extracted from a valley in circumstances that remain classified to this day, carrying 2 men who should not have survived the mission that got them there. She held a ridgeline alone for 6 hours against a force that outnumbered her platoon 11 to 1, and every soldier who walked off that mountain walked off it because of decisions she made under fire that no textbook could have prepared her for. He turned then, his gaze sweeping deliberately across the gathered staff before settling, with pointed precision, on Wexler. She was awarded the Silver Star for actions that this country is still not permitted to fully disclose. She left the service with wounds that ended her operational career, and she chose, of her own accord, to spend her retirement-saving lives in a hospital rather than trading on a reputation she never wanted anyone to know about. I would suggest, Doctor, that whatever paperwork you were preparing against her this evening finds its way immediately into a shredder, unless you would like the full details of tonight's events to accompany your name in a federal incident report. Wexler's mouth worked soundlessly for several seconds before anything resembling speech emerged, and what did emerge was thin and stammering, utterly stripped of the condescension it had carried an hour earlier. "I had no way of knowing," he managed. "The order restricted identifying information. I was simply following the protocols in place for a classified patient." "You were following your own ego," Reyes said without raising his voice, which somehow made the words land harder than shouting could have. "You dismissed a decorated combat veteran from her own trauma bay because you assumed a woman quiet enough to let you get away with it had nothing to offer. She corrected your error in under a minute and saved the life you were too slow to save yourself. I have already spoken with your board chair on the flight in. I imagine you'll be hearing from them shortly regarding your continued employment at this facility." The 3 restrained contractors were led away in handcuffs moments later by military police who arrived close behind the general, and it emerged over the following hours in fragments passed quietly between staff who had witnessed the night's events firsthand, that the men had been hired through a shell contracting firm with ties to an arms broker Cole's unit had spent the better part of a year trying to dismantle overseas. The broker, it turned out, had wanted the only surviving witness to a particular operation silenced permanently before he could ever testify to what he had seen, and had very nearly succeeded in a hospital corridor while a hospital director signed the paperwork that would have handed his target over willingly. Wexler was escorted out of St. Anselm before sunrise, his employment terminated by a board that had received, in the space of a single phone call from a 3-star general, more clarity about the previous evening than they had ever wanted. He would not work in emergency medicine again. His name quietly circulated among hospital administrators, the way certain names always are. A cautionary tale whispered in break rooms about the cost of arrogance dressed up as authority. The staff who witnessed his unraveling would describe it later not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular grim relief of watching a long overdue reckoning finally arrive. Ethan Cole survived the night, and the following one, and every one after that. He would spend 3 weeks in recovery at St. Anselm before transferring to a military hospital better equipped for the long road of rehabilitation ahead of him. But in those 3 weeks, it was Kate who checked on him each night before her shift ended, sitting quietly at his bedside in the hour when the hospital was at its stillest. He told her, once his throat had healed enough to manage full sentences, that he had never actually expected the word on that glove to reach anyone. He had simply refused to die without trying. "You saved my life twice," he told her one night, his voice still rough but steady now, steady in the way of a man who had made peace with how close he had come to losing everything. "Once on that ridge, and once on that table. I don't know how a person earns that kind of debt back." Kate considered the question for a long moment, watching the slow rise and fall of the heart monitor beside his bed, the rhythm of a life that had, against every reasonable expectation, continued. "You don't owe me anything," she said finally. "You wrote one word on a glove with the last strength you had. That's not a debt, Gunnery Sergeant. That's just what we do for each other." The staff at St. Anselm never looked at her the same way again, though not one of them ever managed to phrase their new respect out loud in a way that felt adequate to what they had witnessed. They simply began, without discussing it amongst themselves, giving her the space and deference that competence like hers had always deserved and never received. The nurses who once thought her quiet found new context for her silence, understanding now that it had never been shyness at all, but the particular discipline of someone who had learned, in places far from any hospital, exactly how much weight a single unnecessary word could cost. Before General Reyes departed that night, he found Kate alone at the nurses' station, the emergency room finally settling back into its ordinary rhythm around them, the chaos of the evening reduced to clean-up crews sweeping shattered glass into dustpans. He studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies something he had once given up hope of finding. "The offer still stands," he said quietly. "Command wants you back in an advisory capacity. Training, not field work. You'd never have to hold a rifle again if you didn't want to." Kate glanced around the emergency room, at the quiet hum of machines keeping strangers alive, at the hallway bench where a man had once sat waiting without complaint, because waiting to a soldier was simply another form of discipline. "I already have work that matters, General," she said. "I just do it a little differently now." Reyes nodded, something like respect settling into the lines of his weathered face, and did not push the matter further. He shook her hand, the grip firm and lingering in the way old soldiers greet the few people who had earned the right to stand beside them, and walked back out toward the helipad where his transport waited, rotors already beginning their slow return to life beneath the dark, early morning sky. Kate stood at the emergency room doors and watched the helicopter lift away, its lights shrinking into the darkness above the city until the sound of it faded entirely and the hospital settled once more into its familiar hum of monitors and quiet footsteps. She returned to her station, picked up the chart of a waiting patient, and resumed the work of the night as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Because to her, in the truest sense, nothing had. She had simply done what she had always done. She had shown up for someone who needed her, and she had refused to let the noise of other people's assumptions decide what she was capable of. There is a lesson in what happened that night at St. Anselm, one that has nothing to do with rank or uniforms or the particular violence of the world Kate had once belonged to. It is simply this. The quietest person in the room is very often the one who has already survived more than anyone else present could imagine, and the ones who mistake gentleness for weakness are almost always the ones least prepared for what happens when that gentleness is finally tested. Kindness and lethality can live in the same set of hands. Silence can be a form of strength rather than an absence of it. And sometimes the only thing standing between a dying man and the end of his story is a person willing to wait patiently in a hallway, and a single word scrawled in desperation that finds exactly the person it was always meant to find. If this story moved you, take a moment to hit that like button before you go, because stories like Kate's deserve to be seen by more than just an algorithm. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that the quiet ones are often carrying more strength than anyone gives them credit for, and if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel for more stories exactly like this one, where the underestimated turn out to be the ones who save everyone in the end. We would love to know what you think happened to Wexler after that night, and whether you believe Kate should have taken the general up on his offer. Drop a comment below and let us know. We'll see you in the next story.